you?
Good. What's going on?
Just chilling up here on the top of the mountain.
All right. Well, we're going to talk attachment style today, which is a favorite topic of, I think, both yours and mine. I think a little bit more yours.
You think?
Yeah, I think so. You definitely love the attached style. You're very well versed in it, so I think it's going to be a good conversation. So let me start you out with an idea. So most people, when they think about attachment styles, I think they think about, they kind of born with an attachment style, and that's sort of how they are. And they stay that way.
That is what you think?
Well, at least in the research, and when talking to a lot of clients who ask about attachment styles, they don't necessarily see it as flexible. And so while you sort of walk us through, you were telling me about before we went live, which is about young Kelly and her attachment style and how different attachment styles have emerged from you in terms of relationships and stuff like that, and your whole take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would consider myself secure at this point, but the language I like to use is that my predisposition is anxiously attached, meaning based off of my experience and my wounding from my childhood, I was anxiously attached. But through the work and healing that I've done in my adult life, I am now securely attached. However, I do think it's funny because you mentioned you would guess that my predisposition was avoidant. While I don't feel that, I can witness that I've picked up some avoidant traits from people with avoidance. And that sort of begs the question that you're bringing up. Is this something that evolves? And can you pick up tendencies through experiences in relating or traumas from being exposed to the other attachment style? Based off of my experience, I would start to make the argument that it does evolve and change.
Yeah, I think it does as well. But I like what you say, when there's a predisposition, like something like that's a fallback state, that perhaps when our little child is involved and when our original wounding, there seems to be sort of a programming of like, okay, I tend to be at my core anxious, at least in my childhood wounding.
Yeah.
For me, I am a little bit more avoidant, but then I think it's a polarity issue too, right? It's sort of like if someone comes along and they're extra anxious, perhaps more anxious than you are,
100%.
maybe you go avoidant.
Yes. And I would argue that most people are that way. It's just polarity. It's just yin and yang.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that part of it's a better way to look at it. I think when we think polarities, we will oftentimes think like, okay, they're this, I'm that, and it's always that way. But I like to think about polarities means there can be a swing. Sometimes you could be the yin in one situation, but you're the yang in the other situation. Sometimes you could be the masculine in one situation and be the feminine in another context. And sometimes I think with attachment styles, depending on the environment, the other people around, that can swing as well. And we don't usually think of polarities that way. I think people typically think you are one side of a pole and you stay that way. I think it can definitely move back and forth.
Yeah. So, I mean, based off of our childhood wounding, we're saying we have a predisposition towards one attachment style. But I could, potentially make the argument that there is a major polarity piece here where if it's sort of like playing hard to get or dating and relating. However you show up, typically that person is going to respond in the opposite form and fashion. So really, is there a predisposition towards attachment styles, or is it all about polarity?
I love that thought because I think it is, once you start to mature, I think it becomes an issue of polarity and an issue of choice. Once you become aware and once you heal through some of that predisposition, originally, like I would love to know from you, and I can go through as well. I would love to know from you, what with this predisposition of anxious attachment style, how did that evolve? Like, how did you see it? Is that, a parental thing? Because obviously attachment styles really start with the parents and how you relate to your mother or father. And so I'm wondering how you see that. Like, why were you anxious? How can you explain, that sort of mentality and what was going on in your childhood that made you more anxious?
I don't really know if I've ever been asked that question or asked that question myself. I feel like I need to brush up on the reading, but the main thing that comes to me is emotional unavailability predisposed me to be anxiously attached. So when I experience an avoidant type energy, I want to lean in and find safety and security in validation and whatever it is in that energy because that energy feels really uncomfortable. So that would be me to say, okay, well, were my parents avoidant? I don't know that I could make that categorization, but I could say that they were emotionally unavailable.
Yeah.
And I think that's common for my generation. I mean, we really have parents that are the same age, even though you're technically Gen X and I'm technically an elder millennial. I think my dad's actually older than your dad. But I would say from the boomer generation, especially a little more on the conservative side of my parents, there tended to be a much more no acknowledgement of emotions and feelings and swallowing of emotion. And that's why I'm so skilled at that.
Yeah.
As far as the conversation that we had the other day regarding masculine, feminine dynamics and women's capacity to emotionally regulate.
Yeah, I like the idea of that idea of emotional unavailability. So would it be like when you were coming up, you would make a bid for emotional support or make a bid for
Yeah.
attention, and you feel like it would be sort of lost, like there was no feedback?
Yeah, I can remember that specifically with my dad making bids for connections, which sometimes he would respond to and we would connect and converse. But at the end of a long work day, sitting down next to him, he's a door planner, watching TV and wanting to jibber jabber with him and literally getting sort of the strong arm and, be quiet. I'm watching this. Please don't interrupt me. I don't have time or I don't have energy or emotional space for you right now.
And your response to that would be, as an anxious type, would be to want more emotional bidding or to try harder or to feel like you need to do something to get his attention.
I don't recall doing that as a kid. I think I would have been over. I can remember feeling overwhelmed with emotion, feeling sad, feeling, dismissed, disregarded, and going up to my room, going to be alone and probably disassociating and watching TV or something, not knowing what to do with the feelings.
So that's interesting because that to me sounds like more avoidant in at least a response. Typically, what you see is that anxious attachment styles will be a little bit more clingy. They'll try again. They will.
I think there's a difference there because my dad, there was so much boundary around him. There was no safety in me pushing for more with that. Wow, I may have done this with my mother. I definitely did that with my brother. Like, please, let's hang out. He's like, no, you're not cool. Like, nobody likes you. I'm like, come on, let's do this thing, whatever it was.
All right, yeah, so that makes sense then. So unavailable, and then with your anxious bids for attention,
Yeah.
that wasn't responded to. So you kind of had to go into emotion shutdown mode, or you had to regulate
With my parents.
in a whole other way.
But I think as soon as I started dating or not even dating, but having crushes off boys and things like that, I immediately swung fully into anxious. I wanted that security and validation and reassurance that I feel like I wasn't necessarily getting in my home dynamic, whether it was my dad, my mom, my brother.
Yeah, so let's talk about that then again. What goes through your head and what's that like? And I'm curious, like what it was like then, and now I'm curious as a more secure attached style as you learn and mature, what it's like now. Like for example, if you were rejected or had your emotional overtures and bids for closeness sort of rejected or pushed aside or dismissed, how did you respond then?
Well, the clearest memories that I have in relation to this is when I was married to my first husband, Frank, my late husband, and we first started going to therapy. Our therapist didn't use this language, and she pointed it out because our ways of handling conflict were so different. We get into an argument, and I was one of these with the mindset that I don't ever want to go to bed angry. And so we would have conflict, and I would just push and push and push until we could find peace and resolve. And his need, he had a little bit of a temper and anger, and he was wondering that it was safe and okay for him to remove himself so that he could regulate me. That was really hard for me when he would remove himself. I would chase, knock on the door, bang on the door, whatever it was, because I just needed to soothe and make peace.
Yeah.
Like, please, please, please. I can remember before, years before we ever went into therapy, the first conflicts we would have, he would get pissed, he would get in the car, he would drive away. I would consider trying to go and find where he was. I'd call his phone 15, 20 times, 30 times. If I figured out where he was, I'd go and bang on the door. I mean, there were years that we were like that. I mean, textbook anxious attachment and avoidantly attached.
Yeah, 100%.
What about you?
Yeah, I think I'm mostly a little different, mostly avoidant. And I think I was solidly avoidant when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And that would be like anytime there was some kind of emotional stress or duress in the family, I would remove myself and typically go out into the woods and just want to be alone. So I would just go down and play with my toys or be in my room, or lots of times the weather was nice. I would just like go out into the woods.
Yeah.
And did not want to deal with anybody.
Yeah.
And that definitely dominated all my early romantic relationships, where it's like get close to someone. As soon as they started to get close to me, I would definitely stiff arm and want to keep them at a distance.
Yeah.
And that felt much safer for me. I remember having this distinct, and it still follows me around today. I remember having this distinct thing as a teenager being like, I don't mind if someone hurts me, but I don't want to necessarily hurt them, whatever that's about.
Mm.
Right. So there's this, and I think that's because my mother was pretty emotionally volatile growing up. So I always felt like I was doing the wrong thing or trying to be a good boy, and I just didn't want to hurt anybody. So that early programming was like, please women for sure, but also keep them at a distance. And I think it was because I didn't trust their emotional, sort of volatility is the way I saw it.
Yeah.
Or their ability to emotionally regulate. And of course, as I grew up, I saw that as once I started trying to master my own emotions instead of not dealing with them and trying to distract and deny and avoid and push them aside, that's when I started realizing, oh, this is not so scary. I actually appreciate my emotions, and then I can start appreciating someone else's emotions. So I think I now still lean pretty avoidant, like in conflict. If there's conflict, I will pretty much say, listen, like if I'm with my brother and look, babe, I need some time here. I cannot do this right now. We will talk because I'm aware that that can scare people away. We will talk. I promise. I just need some time, right? So I will tend to communicate that because I know how I am. But back in the day, I would just, kind of ghost, kind of disappear. And it was really stressful. Then I would feel guilty.
Yeah.
Right, and come back. And so there's this really sort of avoidant reconnection type of thing. And definitely this idea that as soon as they start to pull away, and this is typical, I guess, avoidance, right? If the woman's then started to pull away and was a little bit more avoidant than me, I would run right back to them. So I saw this pattern of, I'm going to keep you at a distance. You start moving away from people, I'm going to run towards you. And in the cases where the woman was, like, I'm done with you, I could go pretty anxious if they cut me off the same way I did them. So there's this pattern of they would do the same thing I was doing to them, and I would react in not good ways at all and kind of, get into a really bad place. That's happened twice in my life.
Yeah, I think I experienced that too on the other side, where I learned after I started learning how to regulate a little bit, I got some base level self-regulation. I recognized, oh, okay, I'm going to take some space. If this is how you're going to act, I have some level of self-worth, and I'm not going to chase you in this way. And also recognize this is your patterning and how you need to take space. And then once I experienced and started taking space from them, I many times received that same almost anxious attached reaction back towards me. And I kind of put that little skill in my pocket there for a while and totally leaned into that. And then that that experience helped me learn more and more how to feel grounded and safe within my own self as I, continue to grow and evolve from an attachment style standpoint.
I love that idea where you talk about when you first started learning this, it was kind of like a game. It's
Yeah.
like anxious attachment style, playing the game to get there,
Yeah.
right? And I have done sort of the same things in my life. And I do think for anyone
Right.
who's,
Yes.
yes, playing that game, I do think that's a stage you have to go through
Yeah.
to understand. And then it really does become a way of being that is not a game anymore because you just see it as it's starts out as a way to get your way, but it ends up as a way where you go, this is just the best approach. I can't hijack the room with my emotions faked. And you and I have been talking about that idea a lot lately,
Yeah.
the idea of hijacking emotions. And I do think both anxious types and avoidant types, part of the reason it's so dysfunctional is because they either hijack the emotional space, an anxious type,
Yeah.
or they completely snuff out any emotions at all, the avoidant type, and just kind of like ghost or just go away. And both of those are not very effective ways of being. And so it's meeting that halfway point with the secure type.
I think part of the healing process too for someone with a predisposition for anxious attachment, there is a resentment that starts to build as you're healing from that. And I've experienced this in my first marriage, especially, and maybe a little in my second, where I recognized my patterning when there was conflict with my intention to make peace. I was always the first one to come to the table, apologizing, accepting blame for, my part of whatever the conflict was, and recognizing that there was a pattern that maybe this avoidant partner wasn't able to accept responsibility for their actions as much. And more, it felt like, oh, I'm the one who's carrying this whole thing. And I'm the one constantly evolving and changing myself. So it's almost like for me, my self development journey was the beginning of it was rooted in my anxious attachment, trying to make myself good enough for this partner who wasn't sure about me. And then as I continued on that path, I actually recognized how good enough I was and how powerful I was. And I started taking a step back, like, yes, I will always continue to apologize for what is my responsibility, but I need you to take responsibility for yours. And you can do that or not, but I'm going to stay over here. Love me the way that I am right now or leave. You do you, but I'm good enough. I'm great.
Yeah, and I think that's the sign of a true secure type. And I really like this idea of what we were talking about before in hetero relationships, right? Male, female, masculine, feminine. I do think it's a gross generalization, but I do think in general, men are very good at emotional regulation, but too good. So they tend to be avoidant. So they will regulate so much they're
Yeah.
afraid to express. And that emotional expression is what they avoid. And there is this really interesting thing where they do see, as it goes deep, they see it as a weakness. And so they can look at their woman, if the stereotypical anxiously attached women, they see that that emotional expression is sort of a weakness. And I do think that it's much harder for the man to say, okay, it's time for me to begin to express than for someone who's very expressive to pull back on that expression. So in a sense, I can see how it would be harder, at least from the male avoid perspective, to go, okay, I'm wrong. I need to learn how to regulate my emotions. It's much easier just to go, you're too much and you're too much of an emotionally volatile person, and
Yeah.
therefore you are the problem. And I think that is what oftentimes happens to anxiously attached people. They basically get this thing where you're just too much, too much emotion. I can't deal with it. Meanwhile, the avoidant gets to get away with not expressing at all. And I do think that's a very common situation. You pointed out, and I think self-awareness is the key here. I started to figure out after relationship where I was like, this happens to me again and again and again. So it's obviously me.
Yeah.
Right? And so what do I need to work on? I need to learn to express. And by the time by the time my marriage started, I had pretty much figured that out. But it was a lot of pain and anguish and turmoil and trying things on through my 20s. Then I was married through my 30s. And that turned into, I would say, a slightly anxious, wife with a secure, leading avoidant husband. But by that time, I was able to say, look, I need space. Don't worry, I'm coming back. I just need to get away. I cannot have this conversation now. But that was the beginning of really growing up through this. And it's hard because I will say this, and I'd be interested in what you say, when the higher the stress and the higher the children go, and the more difficult the argument, I think I can still, and this is how I know I say I lean avoidant. I can still go to my avoidant. Like that is my default state when shit hits the fan.
Yeah, if I'm extremely anxious for some reason, something's going on, whatever, I will can 100% go into anxious attachment. And it's from like a place of insecurity. If I feel or I'm taking responsibility or my inner critic is extremely vocal because there is something that I know I'm at fault for in the scenario, I can totally lead anxious, very anxious.
Let's talk about a little bit of what it looks like, just in case. And what does, from your perspective, and I'll let you choose whichever one you want to talk about, dealing with an avoidant or being an anxious.
Okay. I mean, I've had so many experiences with avoidance where you're like,
yes, and so I would be curious what your thought process is and the frustrations around being with an avoidant, and any things you've learned to give anyone listening to this some pointers about dealing with an avoidant type.
all I can think of is I recently had a dating experience with an avoidant. And the best thing for me that worked in that was 100% staying in my securely attached, holding space for them, offering and cultivating space for sharing, continually providing affirmation around non-judgment and love, empathy, compassion, almost just creating space for them to share emotionally and not feel fearful like they needed to pull away, like I was going to respond in a way that triggered their fear around their avoidant attachment. So not leaning into the anxious. So the more secure and the more grounded and the more compassionate and empathetic that I was in that, the more likely they were to stay in their version of secure attachment and not moving into the avoidant.
That makes sense.
That's trap.
Yeah, but let me just go through some examples. So let's say that I know you, right? So I can imagine how you might, do this. But let's say they're more avoidant, or you're feeling some distance after a connection. And so is your approach then to sort of say, hey, I'm noticing that you're pulling away a little bit, or I feel like you're energetically not here. Do you want to talk about it? Like, is that how you open it up?
100%. From the beginning, and these more mature adult relationships, from the beginning, I establish 100% communication about everything so that bringing something up like that isn't even a big deal or it's not going to be triggering. It's just who I am. Like, hey, yeah, I know. So there was a shift in the energetics here, and not from an insecure place, but yeah, like, what's up? What's going on? And are you all good? Is there something going on in your life? I just bring it up.
And a typical avoidant course is going to be like, yeah, I'm fine, no big deal.
And then I
Good.
typically, as long as I'm grounded and able to hold the space, would be like, okay, I hear that. But if my intuition tells me there might be something else going on, if you're not in the space right now to share, that's cool. But just know that I'm here if you want to talk about it.
Love that. Love that approach. And have you found that works most of the time?
Yes. Yeah. So as long as I'm staying grounded and rooted in my secure, it actually is really helpful in healing for that avoidance in my experience. Now, this last relationship, I'm thinking about like where I'm at in my cycle. 100% influences my capacity to stay completely grounded and secure. So I want not to be mindful of that moving into whatever it is that I'm conversating and recognizing that I may have much more of a trigger to lean a little anxious with an avoidant if I'm premenstrual, say.
Yeah.
And I would communicate it off that. Like, hey, this is where I'm at, recognize you know, sometimes I can be hypersensitive and highly attuned, but I noticed this thing and I could just be, for me, being premenstrual, I had my therapist describe this to me years ago. It feels like having no skin. So all your nerves, everything is exposed. So you could be touched in the same way that you're touched every other day of your cycle, and you don't feel anything or think anything about it. But this is going to feel extra sensitive. Every feeling that you already have is just amplified, the good and the bad.
Yeah, that's that. So this is really interesting. I want to hear more about the menstrual cycle changes, but if I'm hearing you right, it's like being aware not just of how you're feeling, right? But
Yeah.
it's picking up what's going on with this avoidant. It's then communicating to them, but there's a subtle piece in there and giving them space. And then this is the part I'm wondering about because coming from an avoidant sort of natural default myself, that takes time. It's this idea I will be back, but I need time. So I imagine there's a great deal of patience that has to happen depending on the person. Like I know for me, when I was at my worst, it would take me 3-4 days before I was ready to reconnect. And for an anxious type, or that's going to be agonizing. So the patient part of that seems critical too.
Well, I think it's a slow burn process of healing that. And it's just an opportunity to exercise the skill of being securely attached that you've been working on for however many years, most likely, to be able to be patient in that way.
And then the question is, how patient do you want to be
Yeah.
when you become secure and
Exactly.
you're dealing with someone who has one of these attachment related coping mechanisms? Are you going to engage with that?
Yeah. Yes. When do we draw the boundary of, when do we stop the empathy and compassion as far as making space for that person in your world of relating? And when do you draw the boundary and say, actually, no, I need a primarily securely attached human, and you're way too far in your avoidance. It's not compatible with where I'm at in my attachment healing journey. And I mean, and that's the truth for me now.
I think it goes to that saying that everyone wants a partner, not a project.
Yeah.
It's too much of a project and energetically. Because here's the thing that we do know, and the research bears this out. A secure attachment style is a really good human to get in a relationship with, whether you're anxious or avoidant, because things just kind of bounce off them, and the magnetism of that pulls you more into your secure. They're good with the emotional
Yeah.
volatility. They're good with the emotional distance. They kind of can regulate in either direction. So it's actually really good for the anxious or avoidant. It's not always energetically sound for the secure because it can be pretty energetically draining. I imagine this where I want to talk about the menstrual cycle stuff, right? Because I know you, as your friend, you have a tremendous capacity to be an emotional balancing point for a lot of people and an emotional touch point for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But based on where you are in your cycle and with your romantic partner, that's two things, right? A romantic partner is a whole different dynamic. You let them in a whole different way.
Yeah.
And then the menstrual cycle is also going to be an interesting thing for a woman.
If there's ever a time that I'm going to get frustrated and stomp my feet and say, God damn it, can you just please hold space or not run away right now? That's the time. But there's recognizing of that.
And the time being premenstrually and menstrually, those 2 weeks.
She is mostly premenstrual. Other than maybe the first few days I start bleeding, but mostly premenstrual. Yeah.
And so at that time, you really need
I
someone.
have less patience. I have less patience for holding space and for a balance energetically and showing up emotionally.
So let's do this because would you say, and I'm interested, would you say that your attachment style, so let's say you're secure and doesn't begin to lean one way or the other. So let's say I would imagine based on what I know about the female menstrual cycle, right, that right around ovulation, you're going to be much more flexible and secure and like, I'm good.
Yeah.
And you don't go either direction, but I imagine premenstrual, you're leaning more anxious or avoidant. And I'm wondering which one. So are there different times where like, this time I lean a little anxious, this time I lean a little avoidant, this time I'm totally
That'd be something interesting to chart and journal. Definitely a more anxious premenstrually, but I'd be curious to know if once I start bleeding, if I just maybe like day 4, day 3, do I become avoidant? That would be a good question.
Yes, estrogen starts to rise.
Yeah.
Yeah, estrogen, yeah, from my perspective, right, I think about estrogen and raising dopamine and serotonin as a really nice, focused, relaxed self-esteem. Like serotonin, we think of as a relaxing neurotransmitter, but it's a self-esteem neurotransmitter. Estrogen really amplifies the effects of serotonin. So it makes sense to me that a woman as estrogen rises up to ovulation, that you're going to be like, I'm good. But as those fall, it's kind of the opposite.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always that way either. It just means if there's something big going on that's really going to touch on my core wounds or things that I'm still working to develop, that's the time that if there's any insecurity and something that's going to come out. That doesn't mean that I would be anxiously attached every month. I also take bioidentical progesterone and I take it days 7 or no, days 5 through 24.
Yeah.
So I do notice a huge difference in how I feel when I'm not taking that progesterone.
Yeah. And just so people know, progesterone is an anxiolytic. So progesterone raises GABA in the brain, which is the number one relaxing neurotransmitter. So it makes you feel relaxed. So if you didn't have that, or you're low progesterone, that anxiety is going to be there. And if you have anxious attachment, then I could see that anxiety coming up. This is where PMDD, like a lot of women have PMDD, premenstrual disorder. It comes, the first thing we do in the clinic is, let's get you on progesterone so we can fix that. Well, the first thing is maybe Vitex because it has some effects like that.
That's the only time we'll see pregnant. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I think for heterosexual relationships, the men listening to this, that would be, and it's something that I'm not fully aware of, even though I've done this work and worked in female hormones my whole life.
Yeah.
I don't know that I've ever sat with, and this just goes to show some of the, the lack of awareness that men can have. Even though I've been in this world, I don't think with my lovers and romantic partners, I've actually sat and wanted to, kind of got drilled down and be like, okay, where are you? I know the mood shifts and I'm sensitive to that, but in terms of attachment styles, that's an interesting.
Yeah, 100%. Like the last dating experience that I had, I guess I really did kind of sit in the seat of educator and teaching about where I'm at emotionally, what I'm going to be like when my feelings are going to come more this way or that way based off of where I'm at in my cycle. And that's, I guess, been hugely educating for the men that I've been involved with. And I've, been described as hyper aware. And I'm very in tune. I've been off of birth control for more than 15 years now. So I've been on a natural cycle and gotten very much in the rhythm and gotten really clear on what the different phases feel like for me.
I love that. So just, I'll talk a little bit about avoidance, but just before we do that, tell us how what would you recommend? Like if I want to get better with an anxious attachment style, even today, or if there's people listening to this, they're like, okay, I'm dealing with someone who's anxious. What are the best ways?
Affirmation, holding space, just making space to listen, and reassurance that you're not going anywhere. And if you are thinking about going somewhere, maybe it's just being honest and holding space all the time. Yeah.
So there's a degree of presence there. Like just be present with the emotions, be present.
Communicate is the best thing you can do, which is kind of the opposite. Be present, communicate, be honest. Non-judgmental or mean or critical of it. Their disposition is no worse or better than yours. We all have these predispositions. So empathy and compassion. I think we both have to have, from either side, have that for one another's experience, because most likely where it comes from is not something that we chose. It's just a byproduct of our upbringing and the environment that we were raised in.
Yeah, and I think it's really important in relationships in general that I think people oftentimes don't see. They'll focus in on the single, sort of episode of what happened. And I think they miss the fact that it's about consistency showing up. This is a question for you, basically. But when I think about being in a romantic relationship with someone, I think about consistently showing up for them to demonstrate that there's a pattern there. So, that it doesn't feel volatile, that it feels solid, that it feels like I can show up and I know Jade is going to be this way. He's going to be present. He's not going to be judgmental. And I know if he needs space, he's going to be able to say that. and communicate that. And that over time, not in one episode, really begins to let that person feel safe. And the more safe you feel, the less you're going to have to act out as anxious or avoidant.
Well, I think part of the emotional intelligence journey and awareness is what I call emotional throttling, learning the skill to throttle out your energetics, your emotional energetics evenly and smoothly instead of having big outbursts and then no activity and big outbursts. Learning to just throttle it evenly across the board. And that's what you're saying about not being volatile. It's about a smoothness and easiness. So it doesn't feel drastic and it's not big swings from one end to the other.
Yeah.
That's what's scary for both attachment styles.
Yeah, that's going to feel super safe.
Yeah, it's all about safety. That's what both attachment styles want is safety.
100%.
What humans want.
Yeah, when I think about my own orientation, like, I mean, obviously it's can be an avoidant orientation, but it is a lot about, I mentioned this a lot, but it is about freedom and it is about the ability to not have to be showing up all the time
Yeah.
for everybody. Like the idea that, okay, you've got yourself, right? I don't have to constantly be on and be in, like, I see it as almost like a 911 situation, right? Where it's like, if I'm in romantic partnership and there's constantly a 911 situation, then I begin to become on edge, especially with my wounding with an emotionally volatile mom.
Because it's not emotional throttling happening.
Exactly. It's almost like there's an alarm going off. And I think this is what it would feel like to an avoidant.
Yeah.
It feels like I'm walking around the house and all of a sudden an alarm goes off. Yeah. And I'm just like, okay, here we go. And then I feel on edge. And as that happens over and over again in the relationship, you start to feel like something's going to happen at any moment where I'm going to have to, break out my first aid kit and like do some triage and like, meanwhile, I've got things going on in my life. So I think from my perspective now, as a secure avoidant, that is the thing that I'm sort of grateful. So I built my skill set same way as you have around making sure people feel safe, making sure they don't feel like they have to set off an alarm, that they can come to me early with, concerns, that they can talk to me and say, hey, can we talk? That I'll make myself available versus these, violent bids for attention. Now, of course, we know that things are just going to come up. And I'm always game for that. But when it's a pattern of behavior, and you will find this a lot where it's like, I didn't ever learn to get the emotional soothing that I wanted as a kid, and therefore I'm throwing adult temper tantrums all the time. That's when it becomes, a situation where you go, okay, this is a lot. And I need to separate myself.
That's the big difference, I think, between secure and anxious and avoidant attached in the self-development journey is learning how to regulate yourself first. Mm-hmm. Because that's a lot of what the anxious attachment is wanting. They're feeling anxious. They're wanting to lean inside of avoidant, like, help me, help me, help me. I'm in this emotional place. And the avoidant's like, well, I don't know. This is too much. And same thing when he's or he or she is running away and wanting to take space. It's just, I feel so overwhelmed. I don't know how to help myself in this emotional process right now. Yeah. So number one skill is becoming aware of your own emotions within yourself and learning to self-soothe and regulate. And that goes, in my opinion, back to the inner child first.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's inner child that you have to kind of get with.
And it's not my partner's job to help me with my emotions all the time and be the first thing that I go to when I'm in this place. Yes, sure, I can ask for support, but no partner can soothe you in a way that you have to really learn to soothe yourself. And that's secure attachment.
Yeah, I think another way we could talk about secure attachment that you and I talk about a lot, I call it confidently detached. And I know people, so maybe we want to talk about that a little bit as a model for, I think, secure attachment. And just to be sure, I think a lot of people, when they hear the word detached, it triggers them a little bit because they go, well, that means you're detaching from the person. What we really mean here is you're not detaching from the person, you're detaching from the outcome. So what you're doing is you're confidently stating your needs. Yeah. And then you're detaching from the idea that this person will actually say yes, because the hardest part for making a bid for emotional attention
Yeah.
is the rejection that can come. I do think part of becoming emotionally mature is realizing that just because you ask does not mean you're going to get your way. And this is another level of emotional maturity, because I think people go, well, I've learned to ask, and you always have to say yes. And that's not the case. So confident attachment means I am confidently enough to ask and state my needs. However, I am detached from the outcome that you might not be able to show up in exactly the way I need it or at all. And I have to be able to regulate that. And it becomes a vetting situation because
A certain, yeah, of course, some sort of boundary has to be inserted there if there's never access.
yeah, conflict attachment doesn't work if there's not a boundary, but it's a great vetting situation because I come to you and I say, Kelly, I'm making a bid for emotional attention. I need X. And you go, well, I can't give you anything, or I can only give you Y.
I think the question is it a need or is it desire?
Mhm.
I desire for you to show up and support me in this way. But ultimately, if you can show up for that right now, I'm good. I have the skills. I have other relationships in my life. I feel fulfilled in these areas. I'm good. Whether or not you can show up for me right now, but it would feel really good if you did. I desire this with you.
Sure. And then if I can never show
Yeah.
up, and the answer is always no, then you're in this position where you're like, this is not an actual relationship that I feel gives me anything really that
What
I
if
can
you-
get myself.
Exactly.
Right.
Been there too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. The other thing I want to bring up is what about the sort of shoulder attachment styles, disorganized attachment, dismissive avoidant, fearful avoidant. What do you think about? Have you had experiences with those in your life?
Yeah, and yes, well, not in my no, not my own relationships, but clinically, yes. And you see it all the time because I work a lot in the romantic relationship realm now. And the way to make this simple for everyone, the way I look at those is they're extreme versions of the other. So a dismissive, avoidant, it like shows up in other areas and it's kind of extreme. Disorganized is somewhat, it's kind of like bipolar in a sense. They swing sort of back and forth. And so here's the thing with these diagnostic criteria that, that I think we should just briefly touch on is that a lot of people go, oh, I was with a dismissive avoidant, and they see it as like all one thing, a very black and white sort of diagnosis. It's usually not necessarily like that. But I will say this, the closer people get to each other or to someone, the more those things will, kind of push them to a place where it's much more anxiety producing if they're anxious, or they will be much more avoidant. So if you're secure anxious or secure avoidant and you're dealing with one of these other types, you may find yourself being pulled on these. And I actually think this is why conflict attachment's a nice way to look at it, because you have to vet the situation. But just in general, disorganized just means it's kind of like a bipolar situation. Sometimes they're avoidant, sometimes they're secure, sometimes they are anxious. You don't really know what you're going to get. Dismissive avoidance feels a lot like sort of an extreme version of that. And they're also very dismissive of mainly your emotions or bids for attention or desires. They're kind of dismissive in general. And you also start seeing some narcissistic type tendencies where, that's your issue, right? That's
Gaslighting.
some gaslighting in there where it's like, that's your issue, or you're imagining things. And these kinds of situations for a secure type attachment style, you're probably not going to last long if you're the avoidant attachment. As a matter of fact, I would argue, and I want to see what you say about this, that securely attached individuals are often the individuals who get people to break their patterns and look within, because they simply won't tolerate certain energetics. They simply go, love you, way. They'll go, not really down for that. I've been there, done that.
Not you, but I like what you do.
Yeah, and I have some balance.
Yeah. Yeah, I've experienced both of them pretty significantly, and don't like I'm dismissive, avoidant, and disorganized.
Yeah, tell me what it was like for you. So let's
I want to go back though to disorganized. One of the keystones of the diagnosis of this is their primary attachment figure leaves early on in their childhood. Is that right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, what it was like for me is whiplash. Like, wait, okay, this is how I'm going to show up as secure to this energy. Okay, oh wait, you're over here now. It's like a a dance. I don't know what to do with this thing. And eventually it becomes very clear and saying, whoa, okay, this is a lot. I love you. And this isn't going to work for me because that very intense whiplash is going to be triggering at one point or another. And it almost, it's a great exercise and training protocol for a short time to really test everything that you've developed and you've learned, and then step away and go, oh, okay, this is what's going on, and this is, this isn't going to work for me. I don't want to live in this constant volatile state, swinging from one thing to the other, and you don't really know what you're going to get.
Here's an interesting thought for you. This will just be, this is kind of to throw a hand grenade in the room just to see, but it strikes me. So this whole menstrual thing, right? Feeling, so you're saying I can feel like whiplash, disorganized. If your attachment style is changing throughout the month, which you mentioned,
Yeah.
that could seem like a tough thing for someone as well. That may feel like whiplash or, that's tough.
Yeah.
Out of the communication and say, hey, this is what's going on. A secure type, the difference would be a secure type would be communicating that.
Exactly.
And not expecting you to figure it out or, hey, you've got to, deal with my emotions. They'd be like, look, I know that I tend to swing and here's what to look out for, just so you know.
And, don't take it personally if I get a little extra irritated about this thing or that thing. Know that it has actually nothing to do with you, and I'm probably irritated about this and that. And most likely, if I'm pretty well along in my self-development journey, I can actually communicate that to you right now. I just lost my shit at the coffee maker in the kitchen. And then I leave the room, whatever, an hour later, a couple hours later, it could be 15 minutes, come back and say, hey, I just want you to know when I was yelling at the coffee maker earlier that there wasn't any water in it. I wasn't mad at you. You didn't put the water. I just was fucking irritated because I'm, premenstrual and I'm just on bench today. And I'm going to fill it with water now.
And this actually does bring up an important point for me. It's a big pet peeve of mine. Me and my good friend who's a psychologist talk about this a lot.
Yeah.
People who've done therapy or in self-development or started reading books, they do use the psychology language and it's often overused, right? So just because sometimes you get annoyed and need your space does not mean you're avoiding.
Yeah.
Just because sometimes you are extra gushy and want some attention does not mean you're anxious. These are patterns that you look at it and you don't avoid because it's a constant pattern. Yeah. Anytime there's closeness, I need to get away.
Yeah.
I'm anxious because anytime there's stress, I need to be close. So we need to not overuse these terms like narcissism is overused, attachment styles are overused. Just because someone can be avoiding that tolerance and beat their space does not mean they're avoiding.
And I also think I wish that the names of the attachment styles were a little bit different because secure obviously sounds like the most ideal one to be, and the others have come with some connotations and negative tone to it.
100%.
And I wish they were just, 1, 2, or 3, or A, B, C.
Yes. And to make it simple for everyone listening, to me, I just go, there's secure, there's insecure, and there's two types of insecure in general. And then there's types for those. But for most people, it's like secure versus insecure, and avoidant and anxious are the insecure attached types. And you can take these online. So that's why Kelly and I know our attachment styles, because you can go and take these tests. However, you have to be on a test because you'll know what they're asking and you can gain the test, which is so. Yeah. So be aware of the people like, oh, I scored secure because they know how to do that.
And the keystone to any sort of growth and expansion and self-development journey is vulnerability. So when you're labeled in an attachment style that has the word insecure, we all have insecurities. We all have things that come up. I mean, I can remember back in the day, early on in therapy, I cannot admit that I had any insecurities because I was just so insecure. Mm-hmm. But one of the greatest things is being able to be vulnerable and honest and fully aware of whatever these less shiny or positive attributes are, because we all have them. There is no human who's completely secure all the time.
Yeah. What do you think the biggest insecurity is in this regard? I'm trying to think of mine right now.
In what regard?
Like
In regard to relationships, or just
relationship.
humanness.
Either one, really. I'm trying to think of what my big ones are.
Mm,
Where may?
I mean, you could probably tell me easier than I could because you're completely detached from me and my experience.
I would. Well, I mean, it is true. We are more. We can be more objective for someone else
Yeah.
than be themselves.
I need a more specific question.
Yeah.
Just broad.
Yeah.
Like what category
I guess the name would say what would trigger you the most in relationships.
in relationship?
Yeah, like what would be the biggest trigger? Like I know as your friend, like sometimes
Too much?
yeah, not being organized, not being on time, like
Yeah, not being respectful of
conscientiousness.
not making space for my emotions, or a big trigger for me in a relationship is like rejection of physical touch or any type of bid for connection. I still do get triggered.
Yeah.
You know, like, hey, you want to sit on the couch and watch TV and veg out and, you know, cuddle. And for a partner to say no, we're not going to do that, but I'm in like that sweet space. That's a that will touch into the layers of anxious attachment, and I have to really be thoughtful and mindful of that.
I love this because if if we follow this, this always happens. By the way, we heard the story about bids for attention for your father
Yeah.
when you were young and how
Yeah.
this would be rejected, and now look what happened. So
Yeah.
now in your adult life, it's like, well, if there's a bid for attention, we do fall right back into those patterns.
Little things I can think about. My dad was always on the phone. That was always the priority. Business was always the priority. So I noticed little triggers with that, but I've had to work through them, put a lot of time and energy through when I'm having intentional time with my partner. And they work a sort of job where they have to always answer their phone, whatever, small business owner. And I can really get triggered about something like that, like not being prioritized in that way and losing the intention of time together. And that goes back to my dad.
Yeah. And the reason I asked that question, and I always go here, and I think sometimes I'm like it, sometimes I don't. But the reason I asked that question is because when we're talking about attachment styles, we do kind of sometimes miss the forest for the trees, like or miss the trees for the forest, however you want to look at it. To me, I go,
Yeah.
honestly, we all have insecurities and we have needs, and you don't necessarily have to be well versed in attachment styles to know what your partner might need the most. And so you can just go, what's the thing that is triggering for you that I can show up and make sure, at least in that,
Yeah.
I'm there for you. I think for me, it's similar. But for me, it's hijacking my freedom or being a bad boy, right? Because I always want to please my mom because she was emotionally volatile. So I'm sensitive to, when I'm just going through and being who I'm being, and it's somehow a problem for people. Because the way I go through life is I don't typically find things that are problems for me, but I do get a little triggered when someone's like, this, and this, and this that you do naturally is a problem for me. Part of me just goes, well, yeah, those were your kind of thing, but that can trigger me.
Yeah.
And I do think as a man, I do suffer from the this is a gross generalization for men, but there's a male ego thing that I think does kind of, men have an issue with their ego. They oftentimes want to be the smart person in the room. The one who has the answers. We have words for this mansplaining and like
Mansplaining is a trigger for me.
yeah, mansplaining and all that stuff. I think for me, my ego as a man, you're always working on it as a man, is something that can easily get the better of me if I'm not careful. Where I'm like, and I feel like I've gotten better with that, but that sometimes can be something where I know it can bother individuals. Like,
Well,
I even told you with podcasting, like, I can tend to dominate the conversation if I'm allowed, and I have to pull that in. It's a little bit of an issue for me.
Well, it's an interesting dynamic for me, as far as mansplaining, the trigger around mansplaining. On one hand, because I've actually married two different men who are complete opposite in this regard. One like my dad, one the opposite of my dad. And so, yeah, mansplaining on one hand, some topics that might feel really comfortable for me because that's an energy that I was around with my father. On another hand, it can make me feel like, oh, you're assuming that I don't understand this, which was a trigger with my dad. The same thing. So I'm not witnessing of my knowledge or skill set and undermining my capacity, particularly as a woman, in his regard as a young person.
Yeah, I think we summed this up nicely, and we can wrap up and see the final thoughts you said. But you did say a while back, you talked about the idea of being present, showing up with compassion and empathy. I think
Compassion and empathy are one of the biggest. Yeah.
communication. And to me, I like that you mentioned compassion because everyone talks about communication. They tend to forget something has to come before that for it to be valuable, which is compassion. Like if you don't have a compassionate, field of understanding for your partner or people, your communication is not going to be that effective, right? Like whenever someone says that I know this must be hard for you, or, you're not crazy, right? Like this whole idea of the human role, meaning that you're normal, you're not crazy, I got you. Like,
Yeah.
and also I know some stuff. I know you got a bunch on your plate. Like when you start any communication like that, all other communication is much easier. But if you don't have that field of, compassion prior to going into these communication, it will go sideways more time than not. So I think people are like, I'm communicating. Well, not if you don't actually come with this compassion first. I'm not sure communication. That's a whole other podcast, by
Yeah, which we talked about this a little bit in one of the conversations we had the other day. And using the word compassion maybe is a little, maybe too vague, or people are just desensitized to the word compassion. But I think the key to any human relating is really being able to look at them, understanding their experience, their wounds. We all have shit. We all have things, and fully hearing and making space for that when they're sharing or whatever it is, and recognizing that we're both coming to the table this way and putting our swords down and not making it about combativeness or defensiveness. It's seeing one another as equal, sentient human beings.
Yeah, and for me, you and I talked about this too, but this may be, and we can end here. But to me, I actually think this is my favorite part of intimate relationships. Like, I know everyone wants to think about sex and all of the things, but to me, I go, if you're not in that place where you're like in deep communion with someone, I don't know how.
What are we doing?
Yeah,
I feel the same way. I have no, even in my friendships, not even, my primary partner. I don't desire any level of relationship where when I ask you how you are, you don't have interest in sharing a comprehensive answer. Doesn't mean that you have to give me that answer all the time, but I really want to relate on a deep heart level with human beings in their experience and witness their journey in this way. I have no interest in surface level things.
this actually Kelly might be a sneak thought of yours actually as a friend of yours. I do think you, being a friend of yours, you are someone who will often pull out the sharing that other friends have not. At least I'm speaking for myself. That other friends could not necessarily pull out of me. It's almost like, some friends where you're like, hey, how are you? You're like, I'm good, because I'm not sure you could show and handle what I have to say. But I think most people who know you are good friends of you, we're pretty sure that you.
Well, you have this too. This is why we get along.
Yeah.
You're a little bit farther along in your journey in that way as far as how that impacts your social relationships. But I can be that way, maybe even to a fault. I'm not sure. I do get some sort of feedback, joking feedback around like Kelly the therapist, but how does this make you feel? So like really diving in with people and.
And isn't that interesting, just as an observation? I do think, isn't it interesting that we go back to you as a child, right? And that's partly what you were aiming for. I want depth, I want connection. And now you have developed a mature way of bringing that out. So these things aren't always a bad thing. They're partly the path. They're partly the path to what makes your power.
You know that I'm going to make that argument. The the worst things that we experience are always our access point for the lightest light. The most painful things that we experience emotionally are always our path for the most beautiful, light, feel good experiences. And it goes back to our core inner child wounds. Those are our main access points to align with our purpose and destiny as humans.
I agree 100%. I think that's a great place to end.
Yeah.
Love you.
Thanks, Gigi.